what I thought we'd do is we'd go very briefly over everything that's happened in the election over the last month, and go over, I guess, what we see is happening moving forward. So the election happened on March 23rd, as I'm sure we're all aware. And once again, Israel had an inconclusive election. So the fourth inconclusive election in 2 years. As in every single previous election of the last 2 years, there wasn't a party that was able to win an outright majority, which was expected. But Netanyahu's party, once again, so the Likud, came through with the most seats and as the biggest party. Lapid's centrist party, so Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid, came in second. And despite Naftali Bennett from Yamina winning just 6 seats, he emerged as a bit of a kingmaker at the conclusion of the election. And then we moved to April 6th. So on April 6th, President Rivlin gave Netanyahu 28 days to form a new government. He attempted to woo some of the smaller right-wing and religious parties, including Yamina, but ultimately failed to do so and was unable to form a coalition. So moving on to May 5th, so about a month later, Rivlin then turned to Lapid, who tried to form what was labeled a government of change, what was expected to be an unlikely coalition of right-wing parties, centrist parties, and some parties on the left. So a coalition like this, or at least the way the media were presenting it, was going to be incredibly fragile. It was going to require a lot of outside backing from Arab leaders, labor leaders, Meretz, members of Israel's parliament. And these MKs were expected unlikely to join any kind of coalition with Yamina on the right, as they oppose or very publicly oppose much of the right-wing agenda. And then we get to May 10th and May 21. So as I'm sure everyone's aware, fighting broke out, and there was a conflict between Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the IDF. And there was a lot of unrest and a lot of fighting and violence that was happening in mixed Jewish Arab cities and throughout Jerusalem as well. And unfortunately, the coalition talks at this point broke down. But once the ceasefire was declared, and now, as we know, in the actual month during that period, there were talks continuing to happen over that period. And on from May 21st to 30th, there was pretty much radio silence. So there were a lot of, obviously, speculations happening in the media. There were a lot of media personnel and people from different parties saying that they might do something, they might not do something. But for that week, there really wasn't much that was in terms of conclusive things that were happening in regards to the election and in regards to setting up some kind of coalition and whether Lapid was going to be able to do it. And then on May 30th, almost kind of out of nowhere, Bennett announced that he would be joining the centrist rivals to unseat Netanyahu, which was an incredibly big move. It was, touted that it may happen, but considering what we've seen over the last 2 years and the 4 elections that have happened, it was a pretty unexpected result. And then on June 2nd, with just 35 minutes, I'm sure a lot of us have seen the photo and some of the videos, but with just 35 minutes before the deadline that he was given, Yair Lapid made a call to President Rivlin. He was sitting in a hotel room alongside both Naftali Bennett from Yamina and Mansour Abbas, who's the leader of the Ra'am Arab Party, to announce that he had successfully formed a coalition with a range of different parties. You can see in this photo in the first meeting, there are a few famous faces. Obviously, you've got Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett in the middle here on the left, Mansour Abbas at the back there, Merav Michaeli from Labour. You've also got the Meretz leader here in the front. So it's a much more diverse, I guess, coalition than what we're used to. And this was the group having their first meeting in the lead up to what would be a vote this Sunday on June 13th. And we know that because, as Gil Hoffman and many other journalists, and then eventually Speaker Levine himself announced that on June 13th, so this Sunday, the Knesset is set to vote on the new government. And so that leads us to, I guess, Sunday and what's going to happen on Sunday, June 13th, where it is expected and most likely that a Bennett-Lapid government will be voted on and confirmed. And from there, we're going to have a very different face of Israeli politics moving forward, with Naftali Bennett set to serve as the prime minister for the next 2 years. And then should the coalition stay together, Yair Lapid to take over 2 years from now in 2023. So with us, we have Sefi and we have Mira, who we're gonna try and have a very open discussion. We are going to leave some time at the end for questions in case anyone has any questions. If you do, I encourage you to send the question in via the chat function on Zoom, because I can see that, and we'll make sure that we try and get to everyone's questions if they have. Mira, I might just start with you. So you're obviously living in Israel. I'd love to hear what it is like right now on the streets, and what people are, or what you see people as feeling in relation to what looks to be this very different governing coalition.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be able to give a perspective from right here on the ground. It is a very tense atmosphere here for quite a number of reasons. First of all, as you said, this is a very fragile coalition. It's made up of quite a few very big personalities, very conflicting ideologies. People have been talking about the likelihood of this actually moving forward, and people are very skeptical up until the moment Yair Lapid announced to President Rivlin that he had a coalition. I think a lot of people really weren't sure that it was really going to happen. I myself, I was glued to the news that entire day. I did not turn off my TV until after that call was made, because it kept changing 1 second to the next. You just didn't know. So first of all, just in terms of that, it's been up until now very fragile and changing, and so people aren't quite sure what's going to happen. It's also very intense because of the atmosphere, most especially on the right wing of Israel. Naftali Bennett is a right-wing prime minister. This is the first time a right-wing prime minister is replacing a right-wing prime minister through an election. Normally, you kind of go back and forth between, you'll have a period of right-wing prime minister and then a left-wing one, and back and forth. And this is the first time that it's actually not happening that way. There's a right-wing prime minister, despite the fact that it is a very varied coalition. The prime minister himself is very right-wing. And there seems to be a battle, a real intense battle for who's controlling the right-wing narrative. Up until now, we've had Benjamin Netanyahu as the face of Likud and as the face of the right in general. And Netanyahu and the Likud have been very, very vocal about their opposition to this government. They've been saying pretty much from the beginning that anybody that isn't supporting a Netanyahu-led coalition and a Netanyahu-led right-wing government isn't right-wing, which is, it's not true. I can say myself, I personally am right-wing. There's no ownership over who is on the right. It's varied, and there's different perspectives on what is right-wing, who is right-wing. But this battle is over control of that narrative. Not only that, but Netanyahu is now facing his the end of his tenure, which has been a very long one. And as is his right, he is doing everything he can to prevent this government from moving forward. And the best way to do that is to get somebody from the current makeup of this impending government, from the right wing, to defect, so to speak. Because this new government will only have 61 votes for it, which is the exact number that you need for it to move forward. So any defector at this point will torpedo this government. And there are a lot of people on the right, a lot of MKs on the right, specifically from Yamina and from New Hope, that have been, I would say, sort of wishy-washy on whether or not they want this to move forward. I'm happy to talk about why, but they haven't necessarily been all in. Now they are, and they seem to have signed on the agreements, and they seem to be moving forward. But as far as Netanyahu and the Likud is concerned, if they can get even one person from there, one or even two, to defect, this government won't be going forward, and it'll give Netanyahu another chance, whether or not it be in an election or I don't know, third mandate is unlikely, but however it is, it'll give Netanyahu a chance to kind of hold on. So there have been very, very large protests going on outside of MK's homes, specifically on the right. And what we're seeing now is there are MKs who are not heads of parties, who are not prime ministers, who are not ministers, that now have like level 5 security from the Shin Bet, because there have been death threats, incitement, just really horrible, toxic things going on online and at these protests, trying to get these MKs to defect. As far as I'm concerned, it's horrible. It's disgusting. It doesn't matter to me if you're right, left, religious, secular. It doesn't matter. You know, you have every right to be angry. You have every right to protest. I understand why people on the right are not happy about this government going forward. I understand why people who support Likud are not happy about it going forward. But when it comes, you know, you cross a line when you get to death threats and when you get to, you know, people following these MKs in their cars, and it's unacceptable. I don't think it should ever be okay. I think any member of parliament, you know, should be very clearly standing up against this. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that as much as we should. But that's really currently the environment right now. People are unsure of whether or not it's going forward. People on the right are unsure if they want to be supporting this government because it's a right-wing prime minister, and maybe you've supported Naftali Bennett for years and you want to see him be prime minister. We also I think most Israelis don't want to go to a fifth election. We want to see a government take place. So between that uncertainty and this environment that's being fostered of, you know, protest and anger and trying to prevent this from moving forward, it's pretty tense here. I'm hoping that if this government goes forward on Sunday, maybe once it's a reality on the ground, things will cool off a little bit. But right now, it's very intense.
Yeah, as we can imagine. Sefi, I might jump to you, building on something that Mira spoke about. So fragility is obviously a concern moving forward with how many diverse, you know, different parties are in the coalition or the prospective coalition. So what would be interesting is to, I guess, discuss what could happen between now and the vote in the Knesset on Sunday, and what you see could be the, you know, the various different occurrences that might happen that might make this coalition not possible.
Thanks, Joy, for inviting me. I think it's my 5th event about Israeli elections, or 6th, only with Zionism Victoria. I hope the last for a while. So yeah, as you mentioned, and as Meira has mentioned, some things can go wrong between now and when the government is meant to be sworn in on Sunday. Meira mentioned the potential defections. So just to mention, Israel Knesset has 120 members. You need a majority in order to swear the government in. So just a simple majority. It doesn't need to be 61. It can be 2 against 1, enough in order to form a government. Now, while Bennett and Lapid currently have 61 supporters, which might be fragile, it's not that the opposition has the other 59. The opposition has roughly 57, potentially 55, because the Joint Arab List is not the biggest fan of the idea that Naftali Bennett will become prime minister, but out of 6 members there, only 4 have announced that they're going to vote against. The other 2, in my opinion, has intentionally never announced that they're going to vote against, because in the right time, if we see that someone, for example, from Bennett's party has decided to desert and move to the Likud in the last second, some member of the joint list might have to go to the toilet exactly when they're meant to vote, which reduces 1 vote from the opposition and changes the picture. So this is important to mention. The deserters are a big thing. Every single member of the incoming coalition has stated that they're going to vote in favor, every single one of them. But in 1990, Shimon Peres had 61 people who were supposed to vote again in favor of him, and in the critical moment, 2 of them happened to disappear, and he lost his government, despite the fact that he was sure that he's going to have one. So on this front, it's actually very critical what would happen there. That's the obvious one. The second option is, in my opinion, is amazingly ironic. Netanyahu might resign between now and Sunday. If he does that, according to his agreement with Benny Gantz become prime minister immediately, within minutes. If that would be the case, we will go to Sunday's vote when Benny Gantz is the acting prime minister. And then what the speculation says is what happened. Will Benny Gantz vote for a government that will overthrow him from his role, a new role as prime minister? If you ask me, chances are so slim that this would happen. Why am I saying it's ironic? Because the reason we got to this point of fourth election was because Netanyahu didn't want to respect his agreement with Benny Gantz. He didn't want Benny Gantz to become prime minister. So all of a sudden, his last hope is to allow to Benny Gantz to become prime minister, and that's how he can save his skin. And then the last thing is, I don't know what can happen, something that none of us is thinking about, but what I'll tell you is this. Before the election, people said there's no way for Yair Lapid to form a government without Bibi. After the election, everyone said, well, Bibi might find it hard, but definitely Lapid can't do it. Afterwards, Lapid got the mandate. Everyone said, well, he doesn't have a coalition, but he might as well try, until the very last moment. So if indeed it will be sworn in on Sunday, it will be the longest, second longest period of time in Israeli history that it took to form a government, 80 days. I think in Australia it usually takes like 5 days or something like that. So it would be 80 days. Ben-Gurion had a government in 55 that took longer than that. If you're a procrastinator, you can feel good about yourself. Lapid had 28 days, finished his job 35 minutes before the deadline. But on my opinion, you can't say it's a done deal. But any of the options that are seen now as relevant might not happen. People in the right wing have started to openly say, yes, we lost, we're going to the opposition. So we'll see, but I don't think the chances of the right wing somehow maneuvering it is possible. So, also, look at me, I'm caught, as Mira said, I'm caught in this discourse as if the right wing is the outgoing government, when actually three parties in the incoming government are also very clearly right wing.
Yeah. So you mentioned, or you talked at least as one of the options being about the agreement between Benny Gantz and Bibi Netanyahu. So I'd like to move, to another agreement and maybe shift the focus towards Yair Lapid, and what at least I've seen is some pretty big sacrifices made by him and Yesh Atid in the forming of this coalition, whether it's him personally giving up the chance to be prime minister first and giving Naftali Bennett the chance to go ahead first, whether it's the myriad of ministerial positions that have gone to a lot of smaller parties and parties that have traditionally not even held that position. I'd love to hear from both of you. Maybe we'll start with Mira, but I'd love to hear from both of you about how you guys are seeing Yair Lapid and I guess the plays of sacrifice that he's made to try and remove Bibi from power.
So I have to say, I'm not a Yesh Atid voter. Various reasons, I'm just not. But I have to give a lot of credit to Yair Lapid. From even during his campaign, before the election actually happened, while they were still campaigning, he made it clear that he would be willing to put himself aside in the interest of forming a government. And he maintained that throughout, despite the fact that he's the second largest party. Really, it should be him. If it's not going to be Netanyahu, if you want to look at the math, it should be Yair Lapid who's prime minister. He certainly has more parties from the incoming coalition that backed him, that recommended him to Reuven Rivlin to get the mandate to form a government. The fact that he was able to put any personal ambition aside in the interest of bringing more people in, being able to form a government, I think is something for him to be commended for. I personally give him a lot of respect for that, and being able to stick to that, what he said in the campaign. It's not something to be taken for granted. I'll even go a step further. Not only Yair Lapid, I think we all have to remember, it's funny, we keep saying, it's a right-wing government, not right-wing government, whatever, however you want to categorize it. The fact of the matter is that there are parties joining this coalition, knowing that Naftali Bennett will be prime minister, not necessarily wanting Naftali Bennett to be prime minister, certainly not agreeing with Naftali Bennett on much of his ideology and policies, and the fact that they are still willing to vote for him to be prime minister and to vote for this coalition to come through is not something that should be glossed over. This is a huge deal. And for as much as we're talking about people on the right wing not necessarily being in favor of this government, there are certainly people on the left wing who have not been so enthusiastic about it for that reason, for the reason that Naftali Bennett will be prime minister. So the fact that all this is coming together in the interest of, whether or not you want to say it's in the interest of getting rid of Netanyahu or in the interest of forming a actual government that will work for the first time in 2.5 years on preventative election, I mean, it's something that should be paid attention to and should be a much bigger deal than I think people are giving it credit for. Whether or not you want to say it's about Netanyahu alone, it's hard to say. I think it's both getting rid of Netanyahu and having a functioning government that we desperately need. So I'll leave it at that. As I think that should be given a certain amount of respect for all of these parties to come together for this goal, putting aside any personal ambitions or not, in the interest of coming together and actually forming this government.
Definitely. Sefi, building from that, so obviously we've seen some early rumors about who's going to be in positions in the ministry. For example, Diaspora Affairs seems like it's going to Avodah. There are a bunch of different, positions that have been given to some of the smaller parties in this coalition, obviously clearly to make it work, but they are some monumental shifts when you consider who were in these positions before. What's your take on what you see as that having an impact on policy development, having an impact on the ways Israel is seen globally, in the diaspora, a whole range of different things?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. I'll be very honest, I almost wanted to write to you on the chat asking you to ask this question. I'm happy that you just did it. First of all, you've mentioned specifically the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. Everyone in this call, you should be amazingly happy about what's going to happen there. It's going to go to the Labour Party, but it's not just going like in previous years to someone who just got that because they couldn't get any other more important ministry. It didn't, like Bennett was Minister of Diaspora Affairs, for example. He is very passionate about this topic, but he got this position alongside 5 other portfolios that he had on the same time. This time, Labour actually went and said, we want this ministry. We really want to make an impact here. And it's still not clear who it will be from Labour who will receive it. It will be either Nachman Shai, who is a very long-standing politician who worked a lot on diaspora affairs in Israeli politics, or potentially even more exciting, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, the first progressive rabbi to serve in the Knesset. If you're a part of the progressive community in Melbourne, you know very well how passionate he is about diaspora affairs. He spent long hours in his previous jobs working with progressive communities and with other communities around the world. So I believe that we might actually see a big shift with this specific topic, from a small ministry that no one cares about to something which will actually make a difference. Also, again, as I mentioned, specifically Naftali Bennett, the son of 2 Olim Chadashim from the US, knows a lot about this topic, cares a lot about this topic, understands that while he is an Orthodox himself, his family was actually a progressive family before they turned Orthodox. He understands how important it is to work on those topics. The other things, I think people tend to think about the seats and the politics and all of that. There was a record number of parties that said, we want that portfolio. Meretz said, we want the health portfolio because we want to make a difference there. Labor, Merav Michaeli could have received a much larger portfolio. She's probably going to be the Minister of Transportation. Why? Because the Labour Party believes that the transportation in general, and specifically the public transport in Israel, has to be fully reformed. When you look at Gidon Sa'ar of Tikva Hadasha, or New Hope, could have asked for a larger portfolio. He wanted to be the Minister of Justice because he really believes that the justice system in Israel needs a shift. Avigdor Lieberman said, I don't care about any big ministry, not the Ministry of Defense or anything like that. I want to be the treasurer because I have my clear ideas on how to fix those things. So while this government is going to have a lot of fields that are almost untouchable, because there is no way to mitigate between Yamina and Meretz, for example, on many topics, there will be a lot of topics that can actually see a very big shift. And I think this is something very important. There is a whole list of things that have been neglected over the last, not just 2 years, 4 years at least, in the last governments in Israel, and really, really need to be taken care of urgently. For example, the fact that we haven't had a budget for 2.5 years, but we want a rolling budget, which is terrible. It's impossible to run a country like that. So I think that the ideological bits are very important here. Important to mention on this topic, how do you solve all the conflicts that might tear this government apart? Both sides have a veto power. Both Lapid and Bennett have a veto power, and even if there is a majority against them in the government, in the cabinet, they can say, no, sorry, we're not going to discuss this topic. That's very important to remember.
Definitely. Some great insight there. So it's definitely a big shift that we're seeing happening in Israel, and there are a few shifts that we haven't seen for a while. Some we've never seen before at all. Mira, I'll jump to you on this one. So it's the first time we're going to see a government that doesn't have a declared religious party as a part of it. Firstly, how do you see that impacting the way the government's going to run and the different ways it's going to run to before? And then additionally, do you see any declared religious party potentially signing on to this coalition or the opportunity for that to happen? Hang on, I'll just unmute you. There we go.
Okay, no. It's a really good question. While there's no declared religious party in the coalition, there are a number of religious members of the coalition. Naftali Bennett is the first religious prime minister we will ever have. Assuming he becomes prime minister, he is the first person who is actually religious. He wears a kippah. That's a huge moment for Israel, a huge moment. It should be a huge moment for the religious community in Israel. Granted, the religious community spans quite the spectrum, but for a religious person myself, I think that should be something that should be hopeful for the religious community here, is that we have a prime minister who actually does take religion seriously, is religious, respects religion, wants to continue to respect religion. I think that's something that's very important to remember. The supposedly incoming minister for religious services is also from the Yamina party, and he is also religious. His name is Matan Kahana. He's also from the Dati Leumi community. Yes, there is no specifically affiliated religious party. That doesn't mean that there is no religious presence. And I think that's something that needs to be pointed out.
Also important, by the way, sorry to mention that people forget it. Gideon Sa'ar himself is religious. He doesn't declare it, but he lives a religious life.
So it's not just that. You could pick out from all these parties. People who are religious, who are more religious. People who wear kippah, don't wear kippah. I mean, it's a nice spectrum, and I don't think that the fact that there's no religious party should be concerning when there is clearly a religious presence and clearly an effort to keep some of the issues that are more concerning to the religious community within that stream. As for whether or not there might be a religious party that would join, I'd say unlikely. I think that there's a lot of animosity between a lot of the parties in the current in the impending coalition and the more religious parties that are going to be heading to the opposition, certainly between Yisrael Beitenu and Yesh Atid and the Haredi parties of UTJ and Shas. There's a lot of bad blood there. In addition, the Religious Zionist Party headed by Bezalel Smotrich. Important to remember, one of the reasons we do not have a government coming in headed by Netanyahu that is a right-wing government is because the only way that would have happened would have been with backing from Ram, which is the Islamist party that's going to be part of this coalition. Bezalel Smotrich of the Religious Zionist Party did not okay that. He did not want there to be backing from Ram. So to say that he would then join the coalition that specifically has Ram within the coalition, not even backing from outside, it's not, I don't think it's going to happen. The only one who I would say I could see potential for them to join would be Shas. That is the other, that is one of the Haredi parties, is the Sephardi of the two Haredi parties. The only reason I say maybe there would be potential for them to join is because they have sat with left-wing parties and coalitions in the past. I find them to be a little bit more pragmatic in terms of their decision-making. I think also that Shas as a party, while they are considered to be a Haredi party, a lot of their voters aren't necessarily Haredi themselves. They're much more enmeshed within the Sephardi Israeli community as a whole. So I don't know that the fact that there might be animosity between the ultra-Orthodox community and some of the parties here would necessarily stop them from joining. I think another thing that's important to remember is the Haredi party specifically have been in positions of power in the government for quite a long time, and being relegated to the opposition now is going to be hard for them. I think we can already see some concern leaking out from their parties about, concern about them lacking funding or some of their funding for some of their programs maybe being cut off. They're concerned about not being in positions of power anymore. So I think that if they are able to, kind of see beyond maybe some of the animosity, I wouldn't be shocked if some contingent of Shas does wind up joining. It won't be before Sunday, definitely not. But maybe once this government gets up and running, it's possible. Unlikely though.
I think also, just to add on that, important to mention, Ram.
So that was going to be my next question to you.
It's a religious party. It's a fully religious party. Right. Just a matter of fun. Okay?
Actually, I have a funny note on that. A lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of these religious parties are not so happy with the fact that there's more of a secular element coming into this government. Moshe Gafni, who is the current head of UTJ, actually made a rather cynical comment with regards to Ram, saying that he was, concerned about this government, throwing out Torah, not, paying attention to Torah. And then he even mentioned, well, at least we can count on Ram to continue to value Torah values, which is, take it as cynical or a joke, I don't know, but it's telling about their attitude.
It's a good segue to, I guess, the next first that we're seeing, which is the first Arab party in a governing coalition. Sefi, do you maybe want to comment on the meaningfulness of that and what that might produce going forward?
I think in recent years, so I know it's very weird, almost impossible to do it, but put aside 12 days in May when the riots happened in the mixed cities in Israel. Put that aside for a moment. We're seeing a very slow process where the Arab citizens of Israel become more and more citizens of Israel. And they understand, and the Jewish public understand, well, we're stuck here together. We might as well do something about it. Now, I don't think any of it is a big bang, okay? But we started seeing that in more and more cooperation in the previous government, in current one. We saw that with more and more budgets going towards the Arab society through the right-wing government led by Bibi. Some of them were just promised and never passed, but still, even promising is a big deal compared to the past. And I think that in this slow process, this is a very significant milestone. By the way, something else that we need to remember is that in Meretz, Isaou Frege is going to serve as a minister as well, and he's the second Muslim minister in Israel's history, after Ghalib Majadla, that in the early 2000s was a minister as a part of the Labour Party. So this is also very significant. So I think this is actually something really important. Ram actually signed an agreement with the coalition. They are not just supporting it from the outside. They signed a proper agreement. They can show major achievements. By the way, they're getting very heavy criticism in Israel from the Arab society for what they're doing. Not from all of the society. Some of the people support them. They will be tested by their own people in a few years before the next election. If they will be able to show, listen, look at those amazing achievements that we could only achieve from the inside. We could never achieve them from the outside. And also two big things that Mansour Abbas, the leader of Ram, did. First of all, he's potentially the most beloved person in the current Knesset. It's amazing. Everyone loves him. So that's important to mention. But two big things that he did. One of them, he gave a big speech right after the election. He didn't mention the word Palestinians even a single time in 25 minutes. And the second thing that he did, he said, don't automatically put all the Arabs together with the left. We're actually much more right-wing than most of the central Jewish parties. We're not right-wing when it comes to the Palestinians, but everything else, when it comes to like opposing any rights to the gay, to the LGBTQI plus community. Sorry, they're referring it to it as the gay community. So it jumped automatically for me that way. Any rights to them, they're completely opposing it. So I think it's important to remember that. On those topics, they're by far the most right-wing party in the current coalition.
Yeah, I think that's a really important note to remember, is that a lot of people assume that they're allies with the left. Meretz wants certain reforms that are far more progressive than anything Ram will be willing to give and be willing to sign off on, which is why Moshe Gafni mentioned that Ram will kind of hold on to some of the more religious values that the Haredi community would like to see maintained. I think one thing that Ram did that was very, very significant, and why this coalition was able to happen, was that for the first time you had an Arab party that was concerning themselves far more with the Israeli Arab citizens of Israel, as opposed to purely focusing on the Palestinian Arabs. The fact is that there are Israeli Arab citizens. They do have cities. They do have needs. and staying on the outside doesn't accomplish anything for them. Being able to come forward, for Ram to come forward and say, we want to help our community in Israel that is part of this country, was a huge break from anything that we've seen from these Arab parties. And it's one of the reasons that this was able to move forward, because it's something that I think everybody in this Knesset can agree on, is there are Arab citizens, they're part of Israel, and they need to be addressed, and their needs need to be addressed. And I think it's part of what made this possible.
Yeah, and sorry, Joey.
Go on.
Yossi asked a very valid question that I'll answer in 20 seconds. Why did Ram not get a cabinet seat? The reason, there are two reasons. First of all, in order to become a minister in Israel, you have to swear allegiance to the state of Israel. Very small, but very significant. Second is that by the moment you are a part of the government, every single government decision is officially seen as every single minister supports it, even if they voted against. And imagine there would be another operation in Gaza, for example. Ram cannot afford themselves officially supporting this this operation. Or if the government decides, for example, to do something in the West Bank, it's automatically as if Ram supported it. So it's much easier to be just on the margin of the government and not being held accountable to all of those things.
A good point, and thanks, Yossi, for the question. I'm just conscious of a bit of time, and then we do have a few other questions in the chat that we're going to want to ask. So I might just jump to two final questions, looking forward to what might happen in the future. Sefi, I'll start with you on this one. Bibi, obviously, it looks as though on Sunday there's a high potential that he may no longer be prime minister. He's been fighting off charges of bribery from the prime minister's chair. What might happen moving forward there?
So first of all, his sentence started a couple months ago. It's amazing. It's been on for 2 months. We're still in the first witness. The most significant witness, but still the first one. Just shows you there are definitely over 100. I don't remember the exact number. Just shows you how long this process is going to be. And that's before the appeals to the Supreme Court, etc. So it's at least 3 years until this part of the sentence will be over. But the very big difference, there's a huge difference between a case against the prime minister and a case against the head of the opposition. In the media coverage, in everything around it, people will care much less when it's a case against the head of the opposition. Just like what happened with when Ehud Olmert was on trial, it became much less central after he already left. The difference here was that it was clear that Olmert doesn't want to come back to the political life, or it's not relevant for him to come back. Bibi very clearly does. A lot of people want to see him fall, and it doesn't matter how. A lot of people want to see justice. So with regards to his trial, listen, there are 3 cases. Each and every one of them is amazingly fragile and amazingly complicated. We can't, really, it will take a fool to guess if he's going to be convicted or not, and if so, on what. But chances are that his verdict won't be fully accepted by the Supreme Court before our next election, which might mean that he might be able to run again before being convicted. So that's very important to remember. You can't serve as a minister if you have a criminal proceeding against you. You can't serve as a prime minister. So that's very important to remember. But the big question is whether he'll still be the leader of the Likud or not. For the first time in many, many years, we see senior members of the Likud speaking openly about potentially running either against Netanyahu or succeeding him. Israel Katz, the current treasurer, he says he will never run against Netanyahu, but he is happy to succeed him. Yuli Edelstein, the current Minister of Health, a former Speaker of the Knesset, didn't say it publicly, but it's very clear that if there are primaries, he'll run against Netanyahu. And so is Nir Barkat, former mayor of Jerusalem. So this will be very, very interesting. The big difference in Netanyahu's position within the Likud, he used to be the guy that, well, we need to give the power to Netanyahu because he's going to bring us the prime minister seat and he's going to bring us to a place where we lead a coalition. Well, now, what I read an interesting column saying that the current government, the Bennett-Lapid government, was definitely formed by Netanyahu. If not for Netanyahu, you simply would have never seen this government happening. And people in the Likud understand that. People in the Likud, many of them start to understand that Netanyahu became a burden for them. So don't be so sure about the fact that that he'll still be the head of the Likud in a year from now. Technically, in 2022, there might be new elections in the Likud, even if it doesn't.
So this leads into the next thing for Mira.
I actually have something to add there also.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple things. First of all, I think most people in Israel understand that if it were not for Netanyahu, we would have a full right-wing government right now, and it would be an outright majority. People on the right wing are very upset about that. While many in the Likud might not be openly, expressing it because they are still showing allegiance to Netanyahu as of now, the fact that they know that if Netanyahu weren't leading the Likud, they might still be in power, remaining in power. They know that. And people forget that the Likud is not just Benjamin Netanyahu. There's a lot of people involved in Likud. And these people have all been in power for a very long time. Knowing that they're going to the opposition now because of him remaining in power is not going to sit well with all of them. Whether, the MKs themselves or even behind the scenes in Likud. It's not going to sit well with them. For now, they're still maintaining their allegiance. They're saying he's going to continue to be the opposition leader. But as Safi said, we're hearing rumors of people in Likud openly or less openly expressing their interest in whether primarying him or, trying to position themselves to be a successor to him. And that's very important to take note of. That Likud is not necessarily just going to fall in line behind whatever Netanyahu wants to do. They're also very upset because during his mandate, it seemed like he was offering every other party leader a chance to be in a rotation with him. They didn't offer that to people in Likud. And he very easily could have. He could have either stepped aside or offered a rotation or whatever it is. There were options there. And people in Likud are not happy that he didn't take those options. So I agree with Sefi. I mean, as of now, they are all getting in line. They're saying Likud is backing Netanyahu. He will remain the head of Likud. He will be leader of the opposition. It wouldn't surprise me if it doesn't stay that way for a long time.
So that leads perfectly into the next question, which we've kind of jumped into a bit already. But it's what's going to happen with Likud going forward. Obviously, we've got Bennett that is now the new, or seemingly the new face of the right wing in Israel. And additionally, you've got a government where it's quite fragile, and Likud support could do a lot of things to a government like that. But obviously, Bibi Netanyahu is the sticking point. What do we see is happening going forward? Does Bibi get dropped? Does Likud potentially join up with this government, pushing out some of the smaller parties in the coalition to make, as you said, a fully right-wing government majority? What do you think is going to happen moving forward?
I don't see, certainly if Netanyahu stays on as part of Likud, they're not joining this coalition. That's not going to happen. I think, we've heard talk from, I think the one person that I've heard rumors of is Yuli Edelstein saying, they might decide on a snap primary and he'll run against him, or other people will run against him. If they do that, and if Netanyahu is out, it certainly opens up more options. You have to remember, though, that this coalition is not only made up of right-wing parties, and there are rumors of stipulations in these coalition agreements that will prevent the right-wing parties from breaking off, and that's going to be very significant. it's gonna put a damper and maybe some right-wing hopes for that option. I mean, it's really hard to say right now how things are going to end up. As of now, I think that they'll move forward as we discussed with this coalition, with Likud being in the opposition. But if they do primary, it could certainly open up some more options. Whether it be them joining the coalition, I don't think it's likely, but certainly if they go to another election, it will open up more options for the right wing if Bibi's no longer there.
So we've got about, Sefi, do you want to say something now?
Yeah, very quickly, I'll try. Gideon Saar and Lieberman didn't say that they won't sit with the Likud. They said, we will not sit in a government with Netanyahu. Lieberman even said more than that. He said, trying to bring up the flames within the Likud, he said, well, Mr. Netanyahu, all you had to do was to step down and I would have happily joined the government under the Likud. So it's important to mention that if someone else jumps in, there might be something. Now, what everyone all of a sudden speaks about in Israel is the potential for a motion of no confidence in the government. Now, the law changed a few years ago in Israel in 2014. And now, if you have a motion of no confidence with 61 supporters, then automatically they can nominate someone else to become prime minister. And on that minute, that person becomes prime minister. So potentially someone from the Likud, for example, can do that, get the support of some other people from within the government and become prime minister on the spot. Now, Yair Lapid isn't stupid. Obviously, he thought about it. The coalition agreements still haven't been released. They might be today or tomorrow. But from what I read, Bennett, for example, is meant to be very clearly stated that he cannot have a role in a different government within the current Knesset. So we'll see how it looks like, but this will become much more difficult. Remember, the Likud is a very, very well-established party in Israel. It's the biggest party by far, if you look at the members, the number of members. There are two parties that have been, in this way or another, relatively strong since the beginning of Israeli politics. It's the Labor with Mapai before that, and the Likud as Herut before that. The Likud isn't going anywhere. The Likud went down to 13 mandates when Ariel Sharon was elected, and when Olmert was elected and then rose up again. The Likud isn't going anywhere, with or without Netanyahu.
So we've got a few minutes left, so I might jump to a couple of the questions that we've been sent in the chat. One of them is based, Sefi, on what you were speaking about before. How does it save Bibi's skin if he resigns to let Gantz become prime minister?
The speculation is that there might be an agreement behind the scenes between them, that they will do that, and then Gantz will join Bibi. The second option is just to put Gantz in a very weird position, where he has to vote for a government that basically will take him from a position of prime minister to a position of not prime minister, just a normal minister. And if all he does is to abstain, him and his party abstain, he simply stays as prime minister. That's what this speculation says. Again, the irony is that, well, they could have just not done anything. And in November, Gantz would have become prime minister together with the Likud. I think it's a nice anecdote. I don't see how it's going to happen.
Another question we've had is there's a deep state accusations reflecting Trump as the actual kingmaker and spoiler, not to mention creating a divisive narrative. What do you guys think about his role going forward?
In Israel?
Yeah.
I don't think Trump is involved in Israeli politics. I think Trump is still very focused on what's going on in America. I don't see him having any real role here.
I do think that that Trumpism has penetrated heavily into Israeli politics. Some people call it Bibism in Israel. Interesting figures from the latest Israeli Democracy Institution survey.
Sefi, just quickly, I'm glad you're going this way because we've had a clarification about that. They want to know about exactly what you're talking about.
Sorry?
So we've had a clarification. What you're talking about is what they want to know about.
So the 61% in this way or another, people were asked what's the biggest threat to Israel at the moment, to the state of Israel. Well, 20% said that the Israel-Palestinian conflict, 9% said that the Iranian threat. But by far, if you aggregate all the things, 61% spoke about this tension or another within the Israeli society as the biggest threat to the state of Israel at the moment. For example, 36% spoke about the highest, about the tension between Jews and Arab citizens. And that's a very clear characteristic of not the entire Netanyahu era, but the recent years under Netanyahu is the very big division within the Israeli society. And it's almost identical to what we see in the US that happened under Trump. So in this sense, I think, even if not directly, Trump had a very big influence on, like Trump's way of governing had a very big influence on what happened in Israel.
Well, listen, not only that, I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu on an interview the other day said that there's a fraud, that the election was stolen. Now, American politics and Israeli politics are very different systems, very different voting systems, very different government systems. It's kind of silly to say, I understand the anger. Believe me, I get it. And some of it is legitimate and I understand where it's coming from. But to say that the election was stolen from, I mean, that's very much out of Trump's playbook and it doesn't really make sense based on our system here. So I don't know if how much is being fed from that or not, but it can, I mean, there's that idea of the tension between various groups in Israel that certainly is concerning. And it's not just in Israel or America. I think it's something that we're seeing around the world.
Absolutely. So just conscious because we're about a minute over time. I'll ask one final question to both of you. Mira, we'll start with you. But I think it's a good question to finish on. So we've spoken about how the coalition or the prospective coalition is incredibly diverse, but something we've also spoken about is it seems at least that a lot of them have joined for the prospect of removing Bibi. And, you know, if they only joined to remove Netanyahu, what is it that this coalition actually stands for? So I'd love to hear from both of you about that.
It's a really good question. And it's something that I think a lot of people in Israel have been asking themselves. You know, saying that this is a coalition of hate. It's a coalition of personal agendas. It's part of what is causing a lot of this tension. I would say that getting rid of Netanyahu might be the glue in a way between these parties, and it certainly played a big part in creating this coalition. I think it's more than that, though. We haven't had a stable functioning government. We've gone through 4 elections. If this government doesn't work out, we'll be going to a 5th. We haven't had a budget in a few years. We need to function. We need a government that is working. And I think that this is something that's been repeated quite a bit, certainly by Naftali Bennett, certainly by Yair Lapid. We have to have a government that is working for the country. We have to deal with a lot of our internal issues. Corona, we want to say maybe Israel is kind of moving past Corona. It doesn't mean that a lot of the issues caused by it are gone. We have to put people back to work. We have to rehabilitate our healthcare system. There are a lot of issues that these parties have in common and a lot of the issues that these parties want to work on. And that's the reason for a coalition agreement. There are issues that they're all agreeing on need to be dealt with. And that, I think that's right now what they're standing for. They're standing for a government that is working for the citizens of Israel. They're standing for a government that is working to help rehabilitate the economy. past that, I mean, that's why they're not focusing as much on some of these bigger ideological issues. That's why they're not focusing as much on, Palestinian issues, on the West Bank issues, because they know that right now we have issues that have to be dealt with internally and domestically. And that's what a lot of this coalition is going to be working on together.
Sefi, your final take?
Yeah, I want to, so Mira spoke very nicely about those actual topics. I want to take it to a slightly different place. People spoke about it as the anti-Bibi government, as the change government, as Bennett speaks about it as national unity government. I think that what this government can do more than anything else, and as I mentioned, the Israeli public sees the tensions within the Israeli society as the biggest threat at the moment. What we can do more than anything else is that a voter of Meretz is, at the moment, the average Meretz voter is delighted to have a modern Orthodox right-wing person as their prime minister. Many people who are right-wing are delighted to have the Labour Party and Meretz as a part of their government. It's not just a national unity government, it's a national healing government that shows, yes, it's perfectly legitimate to have an Islamic party as a part of our coalition. And yes, Meretz can be great partners in your government. And Yesh Atid can be great. And Lieberman's Russians can be great partners. And everyone can live together. And if we can live together in the same government, well, we might be able to save our own country. Because sorry, I don't have time to elaborate, but Israel practically is a top-down society. What comes down from the politician is amazingly influential on what the citizens have to say and what the citizens think. And if our politicians, for a change, after many, many years, will be able to show us that we can live together and work together, well, maybe we can actually save this crazy project called the State of Israel. So I finished.
I have to say, Yair Lapid actually wrote a post not long ago specifically about this idea. He said even if he had had 40 seats in his party, he still would have wanted to build this coalition. And I think that's something to really be appreciated. And he went into detail about, he wants to have a government where Naftali Bennett and Nitzan Horowitz work to figure out how to rehabilitate the healthcare system. And he wants to have all these partnerships, and he thinks it's important. He thinks it's more indicative of Israeli society as a whole. Whether or not that plays out and whether or not it has an influence on Israeli society, it will remains to be seen. But that is certainly part of at least Yair Lapid's vision about this government.
Yeah. And for many years we were used to speaking about Bibi as the person who can do everything in the Israeli politics. Well, he's the only person who was able to bring this coalition together.
A great place to finish, I think. So to both of you, a really big thank you for taking the time to speak with us and give a bit of insight into what's been happening in Israel and what's been happening with the election. And of course, to everyone that attended tonight, really, really big thank you for coming out and wanting to be informed about this topic. So thanks to everyone. Thanks, Sefi. Thanks, Mira. And good night.